Snow rarely falls in San Antonio, but this December turned out to be surprisingly cold. I stood at my living room window, watching the rare snowflakes swirl in the light of the street lamps. The house smelled of cinnamon and apples. I had spent the whole day preparing Christmas dinner. At 72, I still preferred to do everything myself, even though the arthritis in my fingers reminded me of itself every time I kneaded pie dough. My house on King William Street had always been considered one of the most beautiful in the neighborhood. Victorian architecture, high ceilings, carved window frames. I had inherited all of this from my parents, along with a decent inheritance. My late husband Gerald had invested our savings wisely, and now I could afford to live comfortably without counting every dollar. True, lately I had been thinking more and more about what would happen to this house and money after my death. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. A minute later, familiar voices sounded in the hallway. My grandson Brandon and his wife Cassandra had finally arrived. I smoothed my apron and went to greet them, trying not to think about how our meetings had become increasingly strained over the past 2 years. Grandma! Brandon hugged me a little too tightly, and I smelled the cheap cologne he always used to mask other scents. How are you? You look wonderful. Thank you, dear. I stepped back, studying his face. Brandon had lost weight since we last saw each other. There were dark circles under his eyes, and there was a nervousness in his smile. His suit hung loosely on him, clearly bought in better times. Cassandra, dear, come in and take off your coat. Cassandra looked even worse than her husband. Her usually impeccable hairstyle was disheveled, and her skin had taken on an unhealthy yellowish tint. The expensive coat I remembered from last year now seemed too big for her thinner figure. She barely nodded in response to my greeting and immediately went into the living room without even taking off her coat. She's a little under the weather, Brandon quickly explained as he hung his jacket in the closet. I noticed that he hung it very carefully, smoothing out every crease, a habit of someone who doesn't have many nice clothes. Work is crazy right now, constant overtime. You know how it is before New Year's. I nodded, even though I knew Cassandra had lost her job at the advertising agency 3 months ago. Brandon had apparently forgotten that he himself had told me about it on the phone, complaining about financial difficulties. His own job as a programmer in a small company barely covered the cost of renting an apartment in a decent neighborhood where they tried to maintain the appearance of prosperity. Let's go to the table. Everything is ready. I led them to the dining room, where plates of roast turkey, vegetables, and my signature rolls were already waiting. I had spent the whole day cooking, although the guests hardly seemed to appreciate my efforts. Cassandra, dear, you'd better sit down. You look tired. Yes, thank you. Cassandra sank into a chair without taking off her coat. Her hands trembled as she reached for a napkin. I noticed that her nails were bitten down to the quick, a habit she never used to have. Brandon paced around the room, clearly nervous. He would straighten the already perfectly placed cutlery, then go to the window, then return to the table. I had never seen him like this before. He usually carried himself with confidence, even a certain arrogance, which always annoyed me. He had been a calm child, but after his parents died in a car accident when he was 16, his personality changed. I took him in, finished raising him, and paid for college. Maybe I spoiled him too much. He got used to getting everything easily. Nice set, he remarked, picking up one of the plates. Is this the one you got from your great-grandmother? Yes, royal porcelain, I replied, surprised by his sudden interest in family heirlooms. Remember I told you that your great-great-grandmother brought it from England? Of course I remember, he said, carefully putting the plate back. It must be worth a fortune. Probably, I agreed, but his interest in the value of antiques seemed strange to me. Although the price isn't in money, it's family history. Cassandra shivered and wrapped her coat more tightly around herself. Excuse me, Can you close the window? I'm cold. Of course, dear. I went to the window. Although the house is quite warm, maybe you have a fever? Maybe. She ran her hand over her forehead. I've been feeling awful the last few days. Maybe we should have something hot to drink first, Brandon suggested suddenly, and there was a strange insistence in his voice. Do you have that wonderful cider you make? Cassandra needs to warm up. Of course, I'll bring it right now. I headed to the kitchen, where a pot of spiced cider was simmering on the stove. I got the recipe from my mother, apple juice with cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom. I always made it for Christmas. It was one of the few traditions I held sacred. I paused for a moment in the kitchen, listening to the muffled voices coming from the dining room. Brandon was saying something quickly to Cassandra, but I couldn't make out the words. His tone sounded persuasive, almost coercive. Cassandra replied quietly, barely audibly, pouring cider into 3 cups. My favorite with blue forget-me-nots, a plain white one, and the one Cassandra always chose, with pink petals. I returned to the dining room. Brandon was standing by the sideboard, looking at family photos. But when I entered, he quickly moved away and picked up one of the cups from the table by the door. This one's for you, Grandma. He handed me the cup with blue forget-me-nots, my favorite, a gift from my late husband. And this one's for Cassandra. Something in his tone made me wary. Brandon was too insistent in pointing out which cup was for whom, even though he usually never paid attention to such trifles. What's more, he always mocked my attachment to old things, calling me a sentimental old woman. Thank you, dear. I took the cup, but didn't drink right away. The cider was too hot. Let's sit down, or the turkey will get cold. Aren't you going to drink the cider? There was a strange note of disappointment in Brandon's voice that I couldn't explain. Later, it's too hot right now, I said, and began to divide the food among the plates. The turkey turned out perfect, golden crust, juicy meat. I cooked it according to my mother's recipe, which I knew by heart. Cassandra, what would you like? Some vegetables, please, she replied quietly, without looking up. I don't want any meat right now. Not at all? I was surprised. You usually love my turkey. My stomach is upset, Cassandra explained, and I noticed that she really did look unwell. I must have eaten something bad. Brandon continued to stand, not sitting down at the table. He kept glancing at my cup, and I noticed him nervously fiddling with the edge of his napkin. His behavior was becoming increasingly strange. In 28 years, I had known my grandson like an open book, and such nervousness was completely out of character for him. Brandon, sit down, I said, pointing to his place. Tell me how things are going at work. Last time you said you had some important project. Yes, the project. He finally sat down but continued to fidget in his chair. Everything's fine, very fine indeed. I'm supposed to get a raise soon. I knew he was lying. Last month, Brandon called me and asked to borrow money until payday. He said they were late with their payments and he needed to pay extra for his apartment. I gave him $500, even though I suspected the money wasn't for rent. He had gotten into the habit of asking for money more and more often, and the amounts were getting bigger. That's great, I said, watching him carve the turkey with trembling hands. Have you found a new job, Cassandra? Cassandra looked up, and I saw that her eyes were red. Not yet, she admitted. The market is tough right now. Everywhere they want a lot of experience or are willing to pay pennies. She was telling the truth. It was obvious. Unlike her husband, Cassandra had never been able to lie. Perhaps that was why their marriage had lasted. Brandon lied for both of them. Don't worry, you'll find something, I tried to say gently, although I knew that the young couple's financial situation was much worse than they admitted. The main thing is not to give up. Easy to say, Cassandra muttered, when you spend every day thinking about how to pay for your apartment. Cassandra, Brandon cut her off sharply. Don't burden Grandma with our problems. But it was too late. I understood everything. They were on the verge of bankruptcy, possibly already behind on their payments. That's why Brandon was so nervous. That's why he was interested in the value of antiques. Brandon suddenly stood up and came over to me. Grandma, you haven't tried the cider yet. It's not so hot anymore. He took my cup and handed it to me. Please drink it. I remember how you always said that Christmas cider is our family tradition. The insistence in his voice surprised me even more. Brandon had never shown such interest in family traditions. On the contrary, in recent years, he had treated them with some contempt, considering them old-fashioned. When he was 20, he openly laughed at my habits, calling them relics of the past. Okay, dear, I took the cup, but instead of drinking, I just held it in my hands, enjoying the warmth. And you haven't even tried your cider. I don't really feel like drinking, he replied quickly. My throat hurts a little. I don't want to infect you. Cassandra looked up at her husband in surprise. But this morning you said you felt fine, she remarked. You even sang in the shower, remember? Maybe it's just starting. Brandon turned away toward the window. You know how easy it is to catch something at the office. I watched this exchange closely. Cassandra looked genuinely surprised, and Brandon was clearly improvising. Something wasn't right here, and my unease grew with every passing minute. Then sit away from us, I said, trying to sound casual. And anyway, maybe you should go home if you're getting sick. No, no, it's fine. He quickly returned to the table. I can't miss Christmas dinner with my beloved grandmother, especially since we see each other so rarely. The last sentence sounded particularly insincere. We did see each other rarely, but the initiative for these meetings always came from me. Brandon only called when he needed money, and each time he promised to stop by, but only showed up weeks or sometimes months later. Cassandra, meanwhile, was poking at the vegetables on her plate with her fork, eating almost nothing. Her face took on an even more unhealthy hue, and from time to time she covered her mouth with her hand as if to suppress nausea. Honey, are you really feeling sick? I asked sympathetically. Maybe you should lie down. I have a guest room upstairs. Yes, I think I should, she agreed in a weak voice. I'm sorry, Rosalind. I thought I could do it, but I feel nauseous all the time. Don't apologize, dear. Being sick during the holidays is especially unpleasant. I got up to walk her upstairs, but Brandon quickly stood up. No, sit down, Grandma. I'll take her upstairs myself, he said hurriedly. You finish your cider. That cider again. I looked at the cup in my hands. The fragrant drink had cooled slightly, but for some reason I didn't want to drink it. My intuition, which had never failed me, told me that something was wrong. Maybe you should drink something hot, Brandon suggested to his wife. The same cider, for example, or ginger tea. It helps with nausea. Cassandra shook her head. I don't think I can drink anything. My stomach is completely rebelling. But it's worth a try, Brandon insisted. Otherwise, you won't feel better. I noticed that he looked again at my cup, which I still hadn't brought to my lips. His gaze conveyed something like impatience mixed with anxiety. His whole behavior since the beginning of the evening had seemed unnatural, and now I was beginning to understand that something serious was going on. You know what? I said suddenly. Maybe I should make Cassandra some herbal tea. Mint and chamomile are good for nausea. No, Brandon exclaimed too sharply, then caught himself. I mean, why bother? Cider will help too. Now I was sure something was definitely wrong. My grandson had never shown such concern for my comfort before, and now he was literally forcing me to drink from this particular cup. I put it back on the table and stood up. I'm going to get some tea after all, I said firmly. Cassandra needs help, not cider. I headed for the sideboard where various herbs for tea were stored, but Cassandra stopped me in a weak voice. Rosalind, don't worry, really. I'll just lie down for a bit, and it'll pass. She tried to get up, but immediately sank back into her chair, covering her eyes. Her face turned completely pale, and beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. I could see that she was really sick, not the theatrical sickness that people sometimes feign to elicit sympathy, but genuine illness. Honey, you look terrible, I said, moving closer. Maybe we should call a doctor? No, don't be silly. Cassandra waved her hand, but the movement was weak and uncertain. It's just my stomach. I probably ate something bad yesterday. Brandon stood silently nearby, watching his wife, and I noticed that his hands were clenched into fists. The nervousness he had been showing all evening had now reached a breaking point. He kept glancing back and forth between Cassandra and my untouched cup of cider. What did you eat yesterday? I asked, sitting down next to Cassandra. Maybe it really is food poisoning? The usual, she replied, licking her dry lips. I had breakfast at home, lunch at a cafe near work. I mean, near where I used to work. Habit. I noticed how she corrected herself, and it became clear to me that losing her job was still a painful topic. Cassandra had always been proud of her career and had worked hard to get a good position at an advertising agency. Being fired must have been a serious blow to her. Which cafe? I asked, more to keep the conversation going than out of curiosity. The Mexican one on the corner of Navarro Street, Cassandra said, running her hand over her forehead again. Brandon always said the food there was too spicy, but I liked it. Yes, maybe the spices, I agreed, although I suspected it wasn't the food. Cassandra looked like someone who had been suffering for several days, not just since yesterday's lunch. Brandon suddenly walked over to the table and picked up his cup of cider. You know what? I'll give it a try after all, he said, but I noticed that he only brought the cup to his lips without taking a sip. Mmm, very tasty, Grandma, as always. You said your throat hurt, Cassandra reminded him. It's nothing, it's gone, he replied quickly, but put the cup back on the table. The main thing is that you feel better. Cassandra tried to smile, but it was painful. Thank you. I really should lie down. Wait, I said, suddenly remembering the herbal tea. Try my tea anyway. I specially brewed chamomile with mint. It's great for nausea. My mother always said it was the best remedy for an upset stomach. I got up and went to the sideboard, where there was another cup on a separate tray. The one I had brewed herbal tea in before the guests arrived. I usually drank it in the evening and only made cider for special occasions. No, Rosalind, don't bother, Cassandra protested. You've already gone to so much trouble. It's no trouble at all, I interrupted, taking the cup of herbal tea. On the contrary, it's already getting cold, and I'd rather have something lighter after dinner. Let's swap. You can have my tea, and I'll finish the cider. I handed Cassandra my cup of chamomile tea and reached for the one in front of her, the one with pink petals, which contained cider. But Brandon suddenly grabbed my hand. Grandma, don't, he said in a tone as if I were about to do something dangerous. You have your own cider. Why swap? I looked at him in surprise. His grip was tight, almost painful, and there was a look of fear in his eyes. Brandon, what's wrong? I freed my hand and rubbed my wrist. What's the problem? No problem, he tried to smile, but it came out strained. Just to each his own. Cassandra is better off with something stronger than herbal tea. On the contrary, I objected, puzzled by his strange logic. Herbs are much more helpful for nausea. Cider can only make her feel worse. Cassandra, meanwhile, took the cup of chamomile tea and cautiously tasted it. It tastes very nice, she said, and I really do feel better. See? I reached for her cup of cider again. I'll drink yours so it doesn't go to waste. No. Brandon tried to stop me again, but this time I was ready and pulled my hand away first. Brandon, what's wrong with you? I looked at him closely. You're acting very strange, as if I'm about to do something terrible. I'm sorry, he tried to pull himself together. Just nerves. Work is so stressful right now. But I had already taken Cassandra's cup and taken a small sip. The cider tasted a little strange to me, more bitter than usual, with a metallic aftertaste. Maybe I had overdone it with the spices or used cinnamon that was too old. Hmm, I muttered, frowning. It didn't turn out very well today. Brandon was staring at me, and I saw that his face had turned completely white. Cassandra, busy with her tea, paid no attention to us, but my grandson looked as if he had seen a ghost. Are you all right? I asked him. You look ill. Yes, yes, everything's fine, he stammered, but his voice was trembling. I'm just tired. Cassandra finished her tea and placed the empty cup on the table. You know, I really feel better, she said with surprise. This tea is like magic. The power of nature, I smiled. My mother knew a lot about herbs. She always said that pharmacy medicines are good, but sometimes old recipes work better. I took another sip from Cassandra's cup, and the bitter taste seemed even more pronounced. Something was definitely wrong with the spices. Or maybe it was the water. Sometimes pipes in old houses give the water a taste. Grandma, Brandon said suddenly, maybe we shouldn't drink from someone else's cup. What if Cassandra really did catch something? Nonsense, I dismissed. If it were an infection, the tea wouldn't have made her feel better. Besides, we've already exchanged cups, so it's too late to worry about germs. Cassandra stood up, and I noticed that she really did look much better. Her complexion had improved, and the tremors in her hands had stopped. Thank you so much, she said sincerely. I thought I'd be in pain all evening, but now I even feel like eating. That's great, I said, pointing to her almost untouched plate. Sit down and finish your meal. The turkey really turned out well. Brandon continued to stand, not knowing where to put his hands. Not only did his nervousness not go away after his wife's condition improved, but it seemed to intensify. He would sit down, then stand up, then go to the window, then return to the table. Brandon, sit down already, I said with some irritation. You're flitting around like a pendulum. It's sickening to watch. I'm sorry, he said, sitting down on the edge of his chair, ready to jump up at any moment. I'm just thinking about work. I have an important presentation tomorrow. On Saturday? Cassandra asked in surprise. You didn't mention that. Yes, I forgot to mention it, Brandon said, avoiding her gaze. The client is in a different time zone. It's more convenient for them on the weekend. Another lie, I thought. Brandon never had any clients. He worked as a junior programmer at a small firm that maintained databases for local stores. No presentations, no important projects. Cassandra seemed to notice the discrepancy too, but she didn't say anything. She started eating, and I was happy to see her appetite return. Her mother's recipe hadn't failed after all. Tell me more about your job search, I suggested to Cassandra. What positions are you applying for? Mostly marketing and advertising, she replied between bites. I have decent experience and good references, but everywhere they want someone younger or cheaper. Or both, Brandon added bitterly. The modern job market is hell. It's not all that bad, I objected. You just have to be persistent. When I was 30, I was also looking for a job after getting married. Back then, women in business were looked down upon, but I didn't give up. Times were different then, Brandon muttered. The competition is much tougher now. The competition has always been fierce, I countered. The question is whether you're willing to fight or prefer to complain about injustice. Brandon was silent, but I saw his lips tighten. He never liked it when I talked about the need to make an effort. Since childhood, he had been accustomed to problems solving themselves. First his parents, then I always found a way out of difficult situations. I finished the cider from Cassandra's cup, grimacing at the unpleasant taste. Something was definitely wrong with the recipe. Maybe the cinnamon had gone bad, or I had added too much cloves. By the way, Cassandra said, we brought you a gift. Brandon, where's the box? It's still in the car, he replied absently. I'll bring it later. What box? I asked. A small souvenir, Cassandra explained. Nothing special, but we wanted to show that we remember you. I wondered what they could have bought, given their financial situation. Most likely something symbolic, a postcard or a cheap souvenir. But the fact that they had thought of a gift was nice. Thank you, dear ones, I said. The thought is worth more than any amount of money. Brandon flinched at the word money, and I realized I had hit the nail on the head. Their financial problems must be really serious if even a simple mention of the subject caused such a reaction. Cassandra, meanwhile, had almost finished her portion and looked much better. The herbal tea had worked faster than I expected. Would you like some more? I offered, now that your appetite has returned. No, thank you, that's enough. She put down her fork. But I'd like some dessert, if there is any. Of course there is. I got up to fetch the apple pie. I'll be right back. But as soon as I stood up, I felt a little dizzy. Nothing serious, just a slight dizziness that happens when you stand up quickly after sitting for a long time. I waited a second for everything to settle down and headed for the kitchen. Are you okay? Cassandra asked. Yes, just a little dizzy, I replied. Age is catching up with you. Brandon looked at me intently again, and there was something strange in his gaze, a mixture of concern and anticipation. In the kitchen, I stopped at the table where the apple pie was cooling and felt a slight dizziness again. This time it was stronger, and I had to lean against the countertop. It was strange. I usually felt fine. My blood pressure was normal, and my heart wasn't bothering me. Maybe I was just tired from preparing the holiday dinner. I cut the pie into 3 pieces, carefully placed them on plates, and returned to the dining room. Brandon and Cassandra were talking quietly, but they fell silent as soon as I appeared. I got the impression that they were discussing something important. Here's dessert, I announced, setting the plates. The recipe is also my mother's, with cinnamon and nutmeg. It smells divine, Cassandra said, picking up a fork and trying a piece. It's really delicious. Brandon took his plate but didn't eat, just poked at the pie with his fork, pretending to eat. His nervousness didn't go away. It even got worse. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, as if waiting for something specific. What time is it? I asked, noticing his glances. 7:30, he replied quickly. Time flies. I nodded and tried a piece of pie. The taste seemed a little dull to me, as if I had caught a cold and lost my sense of smell, although there were no signs of a cold. We ate in relative silence. Cassandra was clearly enjoying her dessert. Apparently, the herbal tea had really helped with her nausea. Brandon continued to cut the pie, and I noticed that he glanced at me several times with a look of anticipation. You know, Cassandra said suddenly, turning to her husband, I think we should tell Rosalind about our plans. Brandon looked up sharply. What plans? His voice sounded alarmed. Well, what we discussed last week, Cassandra said calmly, but I noticed that she was looking at her husband intently. About moving. Oh, yes, of course, Brandon said, clearly flustered. But it's not a final decision yet. Moving? I was surprised. Where to? Austin, Cassandra replied. There are more job opportunities there, especially in my field. Plus, housing is cheaper than in San Antonio. I see, I nodded, although I suspected that the real reason was the debts, which would be easier to leave behind in another city. When are you planning to move? We don't know yet, Brandon replied quickly. Maybe in 6 months, maybe later. Cassandra looked at him in surprise. But you said you wanted to leave after New Year's. Plans can change, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. I watched their exchange closely. It was obvious that they weren't discussing any move, or at least hadn't come to a mutual decision. Cassandra was clearly testing her husband, and he had been caught in a lie. Suddenly, I felt uneasy, not just uncomfortable from the family scene, but physically ill. My stomach felt heavy, and I began to feel slightly nauseous. I tried to blame it on overeating. I had indeed eaten a rather heavy dinner. Excuse me, I said, getting up. I'm going to the bathroom for a minute. But as soon as I stood up, the room spun slightly. The dizziness was stronger than before, and I instinctively grabbed the back of a chair. Grandma, are you okay? Brandon asked quickly, but I heard not so much concern in his voice as tense anticipation. Yes, just a little dizzy. I stood for a second, waiting for the unpleasant sensation to pass. Probably overeating. Would you like to lie down? Cassandra offered. You look pale. No, I'm fine. I headed for the door, but my gait was unsteady. My legs felt like cotton wool, and there was a slight ringing in my ears. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and looked in the mirror. Cassandra was right. I had indeed turned pale. What's more, there were dark circles under my eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. The nausea intensified, and I felt like I was about to throw up. I leaned over the sink, but my body limited itself to just the urge. An unpleasant metallic taste appeared in my throat, the same one I had felt in the cider. Cider. Suddenly, something clicked in my head. The strange taste, Brandon's insistence, his nervousness when I switched cups with Cassandra. Could it be? No, that's impossible. My own grandson couldn't. I tried to push the horrible thought away, but the symptoms were becoming more and more obvious. Nausea, dizziness, weakness, everything pointed to poisoning. I returned to the dining room, holding onto the wall. Brandon and Cassandra stopped talking and looked at me intently. Rosalind, you definitely need help, Cassandra said, standing up. You look very ill. I I think I need to sit down, I admitted, sinking into a chair. My hands were shaking, and I folded them on the table, trying to hide the tremors. Brandon was silent, but I could see him clenching and unclenching his fists. I could see the fear in his eyes, but not for me, for himself. Should we call a doctor? Cassandra suggested. You have all the symptoms of food poisoning. Maybe, I agreed weakly. The nausea came in waves, each one stronger than the last. No, Brandon said sharply. Why a doctor? She just ate too much. It happens to everyone. She'll sleep it off and it'll pass. Cassandra looked at her husband in surprise. Brandon, she looks terrible. What do you mean, she'll sleep it off? I mean, there's no need to panic. He tried to speak more calmly. Grandma is just tired. She's 72 years old. She's been cooking all day. But at that moment, I threw up right on the tablecloth. My body couldn't hold it in anymore, and everything I had eaten for dinner ended up on the table. Cassandra screamed and jumped back, and Brandon turned even paler. That's it. I'm calling an ambulance, Cassandra said firmly, reaching for the phone. Don't! Brandon tried to stop her, but she was already dialing the number. Emergency services? I need an ambulance, she said into the phone. The address is 123 King William, an elderly woman, 72 years old, showing signs of severe poisoning. I sat with my arms wrapped around my stomach. The pain was sharp and spasmodic. In addition to nausea, I felt a burning sensation in my stomach, as if someone had poured acid into it. How long has it been since her condition deteriorated? Cassandra asked the dispatcher. About half an hour. Yes, she was vomiting. Severe paleness, weakness. Brandon paced around the room, not knowing what to do. Several times he approached me, reaching out his hand as if to help, but then immediately pulling it back. The ambulance will be here in 10 minutes, Cassandra said, putting away her phone. Rosalind, how are you feeling? Bad, I admitted. Very bad. She brought me a glass of water, but I couldn't drink it. Even one sip caused another bout of nausea. What have you eaten today besides dinner? Cassandra asked. Maybe it was breakfast or lunch? The usual. I had breakfast at home, oatmeal with fruit. I had a light lunch, I said, struggling to get the words out. Salad, a little chicken. Then it must have been dinner, she concluded. Something in the food must have been off. But we ate the same thing, Brandon remarked, a false note in his voice. And we feel fine. Cassandra thought for a moment. That's true. Although, she looked at the table. Rosalind drank cider from my cup. Maybe that's what it was. No way, Brandon quickly objected. I made the cider with the same ingredients as always. You made it? Cassandra asked in surprise. But Rosalind said it was her special recipe. I, I helped, Brandon stammered. I brought some spices. Lies. I was sure I made the cider myself, as always. Brandon hadn't even been in the kitchen before dinner. But I wasn't in the mood to get into the details right now. The pain in my stomach was getting worse. Finally, the siren sounded. Cassandra ran to open the door, and Brandon stayed with me. He stood nearby but didn't come closer, as if he was afraid to touch me. Grandma, he said quietly, I'm sorry. For what? I asked, even though I already knew the answer deep down. For everything, he said, turning away toward the window. Two medics entered the house with a stretcher and a first aid kit. An elderly man and a young woman in blue uniforms quickly assessed the situation. What happened? Asked the senior medic, taking out a blood pressure monitor. Food poisoning, Cassandra replied. It started about half an hour ago and got much worse. The medic took my blood pressure, checked my pulse, and shone a flashlight in my eyes. Blood pressure is low, pulse is rapid, he told his colleague. Signs of intoxication. What did you eat? Christmas dinner, I replied weakly. Turkey, vegetables, pie. Are all the other dinner guests feeling normal? Yes, Cassandra nodded. Only Rosalind got sick. The medic thought for a moment. Strange. With food poisoning, everyone who ate the same food usually gets sick. He turned to me. Are you taking any medication? Maybe you drank something that the others didn't? Cider, I replied. I drank cider from a different cup. The medics exchanged glances. Show us that cup, the senior medic requested. Cassandra pointed to my cup with forget-me-nots, which was sitting on the table, almost full. This one was mine originally, she said, and Rosalind drank from the one with pink petals. The medic carefully sniffed the contents of both cups. There's something wrong with this one, he said, pointing to the cup with roses. The smell is not typical of regular cider. He turned to us. You need to go to the hospital immediately for a stomach pump and tests. It looks like poisoning with a toxic substance, not just stale food. Everything at the hospital happened in a fog. I was quickly taken to the emergency room, where the doctors immediately began pumping my stomach. The procedure was painful, but I understood that it could save my life. The nurses bustled around, inserting IVs and measuring my blood pressure every few minutes. Dr. Harris, an elderly man with gray temples and tired eyes, explained what was happening to me in a soothing voice. Mrs. Sterling, we have pumped your stomach and taken some tests. Preliminary results show the presence of a toxic substance in your system. We can't determine exactly what it is yet, but it's definitely not food poisoning. What does that mean? I asked, even though I already knew the answer deep down. It means you were deliberately poisoned, he said bluntly. We are obliged to report this to the police. This is attempted murder. The doctor's words did not come as a surprise to me, but they still sounded like a death sentence. My own grandson, whom I raised, whom I educated, whom I loved despite all his faults, tried to kill me. Brandon and Cassandra were waiting in the hospital corridor. I could see them through the glass door. He was sitting on a chair with his face buried in his hands, and she was standing by the window with her arms wrapped around herself. From time to time, Cassandra would approach her husband and say something, but he didn't respond. Would you like me to call your relatives? Dr. Harris asked. They are very worried. Yes, please, I replied. I needed to talk to them, especially Brandon. I needed to hear the truth from his own mouth. The doctor left, and a few minutes later, Cassandra and Brandon entered the room. Cassandra looked worried, but her eyes showed genuine concern. Brandon, on the other hand, looked like a man awaiting execution. Grandma, how are you feeling? Cassandra asked quietly as she approached the bed. Better, I replied, watching Brandon closely. The doctor said the lavage helped. Brandon stood at the door, hesitating to come closer. His face was deathly pale, his hands trembling. What exactly happened? Cassandra continued to ask. The doctor said something about a toxic substance. Yes, I kept my eyes on Brandon. I was poisoned, intentionally. Cassandra turned sharply to her husband, then looked back at me. Poisoned? But who? How? The poison was in the cider, I continued, still looking at my grandson. In the cup that was originally intended for me. Understanding slowly dawned on Cassandra. She looked at her husband, then at me, then back at him. Brandon, she said, barely audibly. He didn't answer, only hunched over more, as if trying to become invisible. Say something. Cassandra's voice rose. Tell me it's not true. But Brandon remained silent, and his silence spoke louder than any words. At that moment, a nurse entered the room, the same young woman who had arrived with the ambulance crew. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but I need to take a blood sample from Mrs. She looked at Cassandra. You too, since you drank from the same cup, the doctor thinks it's important to check if you have the same substance in your system. Of course, Cassandra agreed, holding out her arm. The nurse took the blood quickly and professionally, then put a bandage on the spot where she had taken the sample. The results will be ready in an hour, she said. In the meantime, stay here. If you experience any symptoms, nausea, dizziness, weakness, report them immediately. After the nurse left, a heavy silence hung in the room. Cassandra sat on the edge of her chair, not knowing what to say. Brandon continued to stand by the door, avoiding looking at us. Well, I finally said, are you going to explain, or are you just going to stay silent? Brandon raised his head, and I saw that his eyes were full of tears. I didn't mean to, he whispered. It was supposed to look like a natural death, a heart attack or something like that. Cassandra jumped up from her chair. Are you serious? You tried to kill your own grandmother? We needed the money, Brandon exploded. You don't understand. We're on the verge of bankruptcy. Another month and we'll be evicted from our apartment. And that's an excuse for murder? Cassandra looked at him in horror. You wanted to kill someone for money? She's old anyway, he shouted, losing all self-control. Her whole life is behind her, and ours is ahead of us. We're young. We could start all over again. I listened to these words and felt something die inside me, not from poison, but from the realization of who the man I loved like a son had really become. Brandon, I said quietly, do you realize that if it weren't for the accident with the cups, your wife would be dead right now? What? He looked at me in confusion. No, that's not. Cassandra shouldn't have. But she would have drunk from that cup if we hadn't switched. I continued. You would have killed your own wife. The realization slowly dawned on him. Brandon's face turned even paler, if that was possible. No, he muttered. I knew which cup. I followed. You were wrong, Cassandra said in an icy tone. You were so nervous that you got confused, and if it weren't for Rosalind's herbal tea, I would be dying right now. The nurse entered the room again, this time with a tablet in her hands. The test results are in, she announced. Mrs. Sterling has sodium arsenide in her blood. Fortunately, the dose was not lethal and the stomach pump helped. But you, she turned to Cassandra, have something interesting. What exactly? Cassandra asked tensely. There are traces of this substance in your blood too, but in very small amounts. You may have taken only 1 or 2 sips from the poisoned cup. The nurse paused. But there is another important piece of information. The blood test showed that you are pregnant. It's early, about 4 to 5 weeks. The silence in the room was deafening. Cassandra stared at the nurse with wide eyes, and Brandon sank into a chair as if he had been knocked down. Pregnant? Cassandra asked in a weak voice. Are you sure? Absolutely, the nurse confirmed. Your HCG levels are elevated. Congratulations. However, given the circumstances, we need to carefully monitor how the toxin may have affected the development of the fetus. Oh my God, Cassandra whispered, placing her hands on her stomach. Brandon sat like a statue, staring at a single point. It finally dawned on him. He hadn't just tried to kill his wife, he could have killed his own child, whose existence he didn't even know about. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly. What was there to say? Cassandra didn't look up at him. You complain every day about not having enough money. How could I tell you that we would soon have another mouth to feed? But it's our child. The child you almost killed today. Cassandra cut him off sharply. The nurse discreetly left, leaving us alone with this terrible truth. I lay in the hospital bed and watched my family fall apart, but what struck me most was not Brandon's betrayal. Unfortunately, I had subconsciously expected something like that from him. What struck me was that Cassandra had hidden her pregnancy. Cassandra, I said, how long have you known? About 2 weeks, she replied, still without raising her head. At first, I thought it was just a delay, but then the symptoms became obvious. That's why you were nauseous, I realized, not from illness, but from morning sickness. Yes, she nodded. And that's why your herbal tea helped. Mint teas relieve nausea during pregnancy. But why didn't you tell Brandon? Cassandra finally looked up and looked at her husband with such bitterness that I felt sorry for her. Because I knew he would see it as another problem, not as a joy. Because for the last few months, all he's done is whine about money. Because I wasn't sure I wanted a child from a man who... She didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Voices and footsteps could be heard in the hallway. Through the glass door, I saw 2 uniformed police officers talking to Dr. Harris. The police, I said. Doctors are required to report attempted poisoning. Brandon looked up, and there was real horror in his eyes. What should I do? He whispered. Grandma, what should I do? I looked at this pathetic man, who just a few hours ago had been my beloved grandson, and felt a strange emptiness. No anger, no pity, just emptiness. You have to confess, I said calmly. Tell the truth. Maybe that will help you atone for your guilt, at least in part. What about the baby? Cassandra turned to the doctor, who was just entering the room with the police. How could the poisoning affect the baby? We will closely monitor the pregnancy, replied Dr. Harris. The dose was small, and you didn't swallow most of the substance. There's a good chance the baby won't be harmed. There's a chance, Cassandra repeated bitterly. So it might be harmed, or it might not. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say for sure, the doctor admitted. It will take time and regular checkups. The police officers approached the bed. The senior officer, a man in his 40s with a serious expression, introduced himself. Detective Martinez, San Antonio Police Department. Mrs. Sterling, we need to ask you a few questions about what happened. Of course, I nodded. Do you suspect anyone in particular of attempting to poison him? I looked at Brandon. He sat curled up in a ball, waiting for my words. One word and his life would be ruined forever. But didn't he deserve it? Yes, I said firmly. My grandson, Brandon Sterling. He confessed to me. Detective Martinez turned to Brandon. Sir, is this true? Brandon was silent for a long time, then nodded. Yes, he whispered. It was me. After the police left with Brandon in handcuffs, a heavy silence fell over the room. Cassandra sat next to my bed, her arms wrapped around her stomach as if protecting her unborn child. Her face was pale, her eyes red from the tears she was trying to hold back. Rosalind, she said quietly, I didn't know. I swear, I had no idea what he was capable of. I know, dear, I replied, reaching out my hand to her. This isn't your fault. But I lived with him. I slept next to him. How could I not have noticed that my husband was planning a murder? The question was painful, but fair. How could you not notice that the person next to you was capable of murder for money? Although, to be honest, I hadn't noticed either. Or didn't want to notice. People are good at hiding their true nature, I said after a pause, especially when it's to their advantage. Dr. Harris returned an hour later with the results of additional tests. He looked tired, probably because cases like this weren't routine for him. Good news, he said. The sodium arsenide has been almost completely eliminated from your system. You can go home, but you'll need to come in for follow-up tests within a week. What about Cassandra? I asked. And the baby? Mrs. Cassandra's case is more complicated, the doctor said, turning to her. The amount of toxin in your blood is minimal, but in the first trimester of pregnancy, any exposure can be dangerous. We will schedule additional tests, ultrasounds, blood tests for developmental abnormalities. Over the next few months, we will need to monitor the condition of the fetus very closely. Cassandra nodded, but I could see her lips trembling. What if something goes wrong? She asked. We'll deal with it as it happens, the doctor replied evasively. The main thing now is not to panic and to follow all the recommendations. After he left, I gathered my thoughts, preparing for a conversation that could no longer be postponed. Cassandra needed to know the truth about the life that awaited her if she decided to stay with Brandon. Cassandra, I began cautiously, we need to talk about what happens next. Next? She looked up at me with tired eyes. I don't even know what that word means. Brandon is going to be arrested, possibly for many years. Attempted murder is a serious crime. I understand, she replied quietly. And to be honest, I don't know how I'll feel when it happens. Relief or grief? We were silent for several minutes. It was already dark outside, and the lights in the hospital corridor reflected in the glass. Somewhere in this same building, Brandon was giving a statement to the police, telling them how he had planned to kill his own grandmother. Can I ask you something? Cassandra said suddenly. When did you realize he was capable of doing something like this? The question made me think. When exactly did I realize it? Tonight? Or had my suspicions been growing for much longer? I guess I always knew, I admitted. I just didn't want to admit it to myself. What do you mean? Brandon never knew how to take responsibility for his actions, I began, choosing my words carefully. As a child, when something went wrong, he always found someone else to blame. His teachers didn't explain things well. His classmates got in the way. I punished him too harshly. He grew up believing that the world owed him something. Cassandra listened intently, and I could see her recognizing her husband's character traits in my words. After his parents died, it got even worse, I continued. I thought it was because of grief, because of psychological trauma. So I tried not to upset him and gave him everything he asked for: money for college, for a car, for an apartment after the wedding. Every time he had a problem, I solved it. You spoiled him, Cassandra stated without judgment in her voice. Yes, I spoiled him, but that's not the problem. The problem is that he never felt grateful. For him, my help was a duty, not a gift. And when the money ran out, I turned from a benefactor into an obstacle in his eyes. We fell silent again. In the hallway, we could hear the muffled voices of the medical staff and the sounds of medical equipment. Normal hospital life continued, despite the personal drama unfolding within these walls. Rosalind, Cassandra said, can I ask you one more question? Of course. Will you forgive him? The question came as a surprise, and I realized I wasn't ready to answer it. Forgive a man who tried to kill me? A man who could have killed his own pregnant wife? A man who saw my death as nothing more than a way to solve his financial problems? I don't know, I answered honestly. Forgiveness is not something that happens instantly, maybe with time, but right now, I only feel emptiness. I understand, Cassandra nodded. And how do you feel about me? You? I was surprised. You have nothing to do with this. But I'm his wife. I'm carrying his child. I couldn't stop him. I couldn't even suspect. Cassandra, I interrupted, you were just as much a victim as I was. Perhaps even more so. I lost a grandson whom, as it turned out, I didn't really know. And you lost your husband, the father of your child, your family. The tears she had held back for so long finally flowed. Cassandra cried quietly, almost silently, but with her whole body. I handed her some tissues from the box on the bedside table. What am I going to do? She sobbed. How am I going to raise a child on my own? I don't have a job. I don't have any money. And now I don't even have a husband. You have me, I said firmly, and so does the baby. She looked up at me in surprise. But it's Brandon's child. It's a child who is not to blame for its father's actions, and you're not to blame for marrying a man who knew how to hide his true nature. A nurse peeked into the room. Excuse me, but Detective Martinez is here. He wants to ask you a few more questions. Let him in, I said. The detective looked even more serious than before. He was carrying a folder with documents. Mrs. Sterling, your grandson has given a full statement. He told us where he bought the poison and how he planned the crime. He also admitted that he had been considering murder for several months. Several months? I asked. Yes. He researched various methods and read about poisons on the internet. He chose sodium arsenide because its symptoms can be confused with a heart attack, especially in older people. Cassandra turned even paler. So it wasn't a spontaneous decision, she said quietly. He planned it for a long time. Unfortunately, yes, the detective confirmed. But there is one thing that shocked him greatly. When we told him about his wife's pregnancy, he fainted right there in the interrogation room. I see, I said, feeling no sympathy for Brandon. What happens next? Tomorrow he will be taken to court for a pretrial hearing. Given the seriousness of the charges and his confession, he will most likely be remanded in custody until the trial. The trial will take place in a few months. Will I have to testify? Cassandra asked. Yes, you will both be key witnesses for the prosecution. But that's later. Right now, the main thing is to recover from what you've been through. After the detective left, Cassandra and I were alone again. She looked completely devastated, as if she had aged several years in one evening. Rosalind, she said suddenly, Can I ask you about the inheritance? The question came as a surprise, and I saw her blush immediately. I'm not asking because of the money, she quickly added. It's just, Brandon said he was planning to transfer everything to himself, and now I don't know. I understand your concern, I replied calmly. Yes, Brandon was the sole heir, but after tonight, the situation will change. Meaning? Meaning I'll contact a lawyer and change the will. Brandon won't get a cent. Cassandra nodded, but I could see she was thinking about something else. What about the house? Your belongings? I don't know yet, I admitted. I need time to think it over. But one thing I know for sure is that Brandon shouldn't get what he tried to kill me for. We talked for about another hour, discussing practical matters. Cassandra needed to go back to their apartment to pick up her personal belongings. She needed to find a lawyer for the divorce proceedings. She needed to decide where to live, how to support herself, and how to look for a job while pregnant. Cassandra, I said as we were getting ready to leave, I want you to know one thing. What Brandon did hasn't changed how I feel about you. You were and always will be part of my family. Even after the divorce? Even after the divorce, you're carrying my great-grandson or great-granddaughter, and that child deserves to know his or her family, the part of it that is capable of love, not just greed. Cassandra cried again, but this time the tears were not only of grief, but also of relief. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't know how to tell you that I'm afraid of being left all alone. You're not alone, I assured her, and you'll never be alone as long as I'm alive. When Cassandra left, I was left alone with my thoughts. It was already late at night outside, but sleep would not come. I lay there thinking about how the man I had raised since he was a teenager could have changed so much. Or had he not changed, and I just hadn't seen his true colors? Perhaps the signs had always been there, but I had ignored them. His indifference to my problems when my joints ached or I suffered from insomnia. His irritation when I asked for help around the house. His unwillingness to spend time together unless it benefited him. I thought about the phone calls over the last few months when he only called to ask for money. How he always found excuses for his failures but never thanked me for my help. How his voice changed when the subject of my health came up. Not concern, but calculation. Not love, but impatience. All the signs were there, but I didn't notice them. Or didn't want to notice them, because admitting the truth would mean admitting that I had raised a monster. The nurse came around midnight with the last dose of medicine. How are you feeling? She asked. Physically, better, I replied. Mentally, it's hard to say. I understand. Things like this don't go away without a trace. Maybe you should see a psychologist. Maybe, I agreed, although right now I need time to just process everything. Of course, but remember, it's not your fault. You couldn't have known what your grandson was capable of. After she left, I was finally able to get some sleep. I had some disturbing dreams. Brandon as a child crying over his parents' graves. Brandon as a teenager lying to my face about a broken vase. Brandon as an adult adding poison to my cup and smiling. In the morning, I was discharged from the hospital. Cassandra came to pick me up in a taxi. She didn't dare drive after yesterday's stress. How did you sleep? She asked. Bad, I answered honestly. How about you? I didn't sleep at all. I spent the whole night thinking about what would happen next. We drove through San Antonio in the morning, and I looked at the familiar streets, thinking about how the world had changed overnight. Yesterday, I had a grandson who, while not particularly attentive, was still a loved one. Today, I have a potential murderer who bears my last name and is sitting in a prison cell. But I also have Cassandra and her unborn child. And this may be a chance to correct the mistakes of the past. 3 days after being discharged from the hospital, Cassandra called me in the morning. Her voice sounded a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Rosalind, I just got back from the doctor. Good news, the baby is fine. The ultrasound showed normal development, and the blood tests are good too. Thank God. I sat down on a kitchen chair, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. So the poison didn't affect it? The doctor says the dose was too small to cause serious harm. Plus, I only took a few sips. Cassandra's voice trembled. Rosalind, I still can't believe this really happened. We saw each other every day for the past 3 days. Cassandra helped me around the house, brought me groceries, just sat with me when I was overwhelmed by thoughts of what had happened. I thought she was doing it out of politeness or guilt, but gradually I realized that she needed support herself. Cassandra, have you thought about seeing Brandon? I asked cautiously. There was a long pause. He asked for a meeting. He sent a message through his lawyer, she finally replied. But I don't know if I can look at him. I understand, but maybe you need to talk to him. Not to forgive him, but to understand everything for yourself. Do you think so? I think you have a right to know the truth. The whole truth. How long he had been planning it. Why he decided to do it now. Whether he thought about you when he prepared the poison. Cassandra was silent, digesting my words. Will you come with me? She asked suddenly. If I decide to, I can't do this alone. Of course I'll go, I replied without hesitation. If you're ready to meet him face to face, I'll be there. The meeting was scheduled for Friday. The Bexar County Jail was a gloomy gray concrete building on the outskirts of town. We took a taxi together. Cassandra was still afraid to drive, and I didn't feel entirely confident behind the wheel after my poisoning. Brandon's lawyer met us in the reception area, a young man in his 30s with tired eyes and a cheap suit. Clearly, Brandon couldn't afford an expensive defense attorney. Mrs. Sterling, he said to me, my client really wants to talk to you. He asked me to tell you that he regrets what happened. Regrets that it didn't work out? I asked coldly. The lawyer looked embarrassed. He regrets his actions. He understands that he did the wrong thing. Wrong? Cassandra repeated. He tried to commit murder, and you call that wrong? I understand how you feel. The lawyer tried to smooth things over. But my client is in a state of deep depression. He doesn't sleep. He hardly eats. He constantly talks about how he could have killed his own child. And that's supposed to move me? Cassandra looked surprised. No, of course not. I just want you to be prepared for what you're about to see. Brandon has changed a lot these past few days. We were led through a metal detector into the visiting room. It was divided by thick glass, and communication took place through telephone tubes. We sat down at table number 5 and waited. Brandon appeared a few minutes later, accompanied by a guard. The lawyer was right. My grandson had changed a lot. He had lost weight, looked haggard, and his prison uniform hung loosely on him. His hair was tousled, and there were deep shadows under his eyes. But what struck me most was the expression on his face. Lost, almost childlike. He sat down opposite us and picked up the receiver with trembling hands. Grandma, he whispered, and I could hear his voice trembling. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Talk to your wife, I said dryly. She's the one you owe an explanation to. Brandon looked at Cassandra, and I saw his face contort with pain. Cassie, he began, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you were pregnant. And that's all you have to say? Cassandra's voice was even, but I could tell how much effort it was taking her. Didn't know you were pregnant? He faltered. I didn't think you could get hurt. I knew which cup was poisoned. You were wrong, Cassandra stated. You got confused in your panic. Yes, I was wrong. Brandon covered his face with his hands. God, I almost killed you. I almost killed our child. You tried to kill Rosalind, Cassandra corrected him. The person who raised you, educated you, helped you financially, and that's just as terrible. Brandon raised his head and looked at me. Grandma, I know you hate me. I don't hate you, I interrupted. Hate requires emotion, and I don't feel that anymore. I just don't understand how you could have let it get to this point. Debt, he whispered. We owed money on the apartment. Our credit cards were maxed out. Cassie lost her job. I didn't see a way out. And murder seemed like the only way out? Cassandra asked. Not the only way. I thought about other options. Brandon's voice rose, but he quickly regained his composure. I tried to find extra work, asked the bank for a loan, even wanted to sell the car, but it wasn't enough. So you'd been planning this for a long time, Cassandra realized. Was murder a backup plan? Brandon was silent, and that silence was his answer. How long? Cassandra insisted. How long had you been thinking about killing Rosalind? 3 months, he admitted, barely audibly. 3 months, Cassandra repeated, as if tasting the words. For 3 months, you woke up every day, kissed me goodbye, and went to work thinking about murder. Cassie, you don't understand. I was desperate. No, you don't understand. For the first time, Cassandra's voice trembled with emotion. You could have come to me and said, we have serious problems. We need to do something about it. We could have looked for a solution together. Move to a cheaper apartment, take out a loan against my share of my parents' house, ask friends for help. But you chose to plan a murder because it seemed easier to you than honestly admitting to your wife that you're a failure. Brandon cringed at her words. Cassie, I love you. Don't you dare. Cassandra cut him off sharply. Don't you dare talk about love. People don't plan murders for money when they love someone. They don't endanger the lives of the woman they love and her child for their own gain. I watched this scene in silence, feeling a strange mixture of pain and relief. Pain that the family I considered my own was falling apart. Relief that Cassandra finally saw Brandon for who he really was. Now explain one thing to me, Cassandra continued. If the plan had worked, if Rosalind had died, what would you have told me? How would you have explained her death? Brandon looked at us, confused. I thought it would look like a heart attack. Her age, the stress of preparing for the holiday. And you would have comforted me, Cassandra understood. Hugged me when I cried at the funeral. You would say that everything would be fine, that we had an inheritance and could start a new life. Cassie? And then we would have spent Rosalind's money on our child. We would have bought a stroller, a crib, toys with blood money. And every day you would have looked at me and the baby, knowing that we were living off murder. Brandon was now crying openly, not caring about the guard or the other visitors. I didn't imagine it would be like this. Because you only thought about the money, Cassandra said harshly. To you, Rosalind wasn't a person. She was an obstacle to your inheritance. That's not true. Then tell me. Cassandra leaned toward the glass. When was the last time you asked Rosalind how she was doing? Not to find out when she would die, but because you were genuinely interested. Brandon opened his mouth but couldn't answer. When was the last time you called her just to talk? When did you offer to help around the house? When did you give her gifts not on obligatory holidays, but simply out of a desire to please her? Each of Cassandra's questions was like a slap in the face, and I could see that Brandon understood he had no answers. I was a fool, Cassandra said, more to herself than to him. All those months when you were irritable and withdrawn, I thought it was because of work. When you stopped having sex, I thought you were tired. When you started drinking in the evenings, I thought it was because of stress. Cassie, I'm sorry. But in reality, you were planning a murder. You researched poisons on the internet. You chose the most suitable way to kill an elderly woman who loved you. Brandon no longer tried to justify himself. He sat with his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm filing for divorce," Cassandra said calmly, "and I don't want you to try to contact me." "What about the baby?" Brandon raised his head. "It's my child, too." "The child you almost killed," Cassandra reminded him. "I don't want him to grow up knowing his father is a murderer." "I'm not a murderer. Attempted murder is different." "Is it?" Cassandra smiled bitterly. "What's the difference? That you were unlucky? That we accidentally switched cups?" Brandon fell silent again. "You know what's the scariest thing?" Cassandra continued. "Even now, in prison, you're not thinking about the fact that you almost killed two innocent people. You're thinking about getting caught. You're not sorry for the crime, you're sorry for the consequences." "That's not true." "It is. If everything had gone according to plan, you'd be sitting at home right now, counting your inheritance and planning purchases for the baby. And you'd be sleeping peacefully, knowing that Rosalind was 6 feet under." I looked at my grandson and realized that Cassandra was right. In his eyes, I saw not remorse, but regret at his failure. He was crying not because he realized the monstrosity of his actions, but because he had been caught. "Visiting time is over," announced the guard. Cassandra stood up, put down the phone, and headed for the exit. I paused for a second looking at Brandon. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the phone. "Please forgive me." "No," I replied simply and hung up too. We sat in silence in the car for a long time. Cassandra stared out the window, and I thought about how I had just buried my grandson for good. Not because he tried to kill me, that would have been too simple. It was because he still didn't understand what he had done wrong. "Rosalind," Cassandra finally said, "thank you for coming with me." "Was it hard for you?" "Yes, but now I know for sure that I'm making the right decision." "Divorce?" "Divorce," she nodded. "I can't be married to a man who is capable of murder, and I don't want my child to grow up thinking that such things can be forgiven." We arrived at my house, and Cassandra, as she had been doing for the past few days, went into the kitchen to make tea. It had become our ritual to sit at the kitchen table, drink tea, and talk about everything except Brandon. "You know," Cassandra said, pouring boiling water into the teapot, "I think today is the first time in many months that I don't feel nauseous." "So the morning sickness is passing," I smiled. "That's a good sign. Or maybe I've just finally gotten rid of the main source of nausea in my life." She smiled sadly. "You know, I keep thinking, were there any signs? Was I really so blind that I didn't notice anything?" "Cassandra," I said seriously, "it's not your fault that you couldn't recognize a potential murderer in your own husband. Brandon was good at pretending. He pretended even to me for many years. But you suspected him, didn't you? When he was so insistent about offering you that cup, I suspected something was wrong. But murder? No, even in my worst nightmares, I couldn't have imagined that." We sat there sipping our tea, both thinking about how radically our lives had changed in just 1 week. Cassandra no longer had a husband, but she had a child. I no longer had a grandson, but I had the opportunity to correct my parenting mistakes. "Rosalind," Cassandra said suddenly, "are you really going to change the will?" "I already have," I replied. "I went to the lawyer yesterday. Now you will be the primary heir, and your child." Cassandra put down her cup and looked at me in surprise. "But why? I'm not your blood relative." "You are the mother of my great-grandson or great-granddaughter, and besides, you're the only one who really cares about me." I covered her hand with mine. "Brandon only thought about money. You think about people." I don't know what to say. "Don't say anything. Just know that you and your child will have a home and a livelihood, no matter what happens to Brandon." That evening, after Cassandra had gone to her room, I sat in the living room and thought about the strange twists and turns of fate. I lost a grandson, but I gained a daughter. I lost faith in blood ties, but I found a real family. And somewhere in a prison cell, a man with my last name was sitting and planning how to convince the court that he deserved leniency. A week after the prison visit, I sat in James Wilson's office, rereading the new will. The middle-aged man with a neat gray beard waited patiently while I studied every line of the document that permanently excluded Brandon from my life. "Are you sure about your decision, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked when I put the papers down. "Disinheriting a blood relative is a serious step." "Absolutely sure," I replied firmly. "A man who tried to poison me doesn't deserve a penny of my money." Mr. Wilson nodded and pushed the documents forward for me to sign. "Under the new will, Cassandra Sterling, your daughter-in-law, becomes the primary beneficiary. The house, bank accounts, investments, everything passes to her. You are also creating a trust fund for her unborn child." "That's correct," I said, picking up the pen. "What about Brandon's personal belongings in the house?" "Since he is still formally your grandson, he has the right to take his personal belongings, but only under supervision and only those items that belonged to him before his arrest." "I see. What about the family photos?" "They remain with you. They are your property." I signed the will with a flourish, feeling a strange sense of relief. Now Brandon would officially get nothing from what he had tried to kill me for. "There's one more thing," said the lawyer, putting the documents away in the safe. "Your grandson's defense team has contacted me. They want to discuss the possibility of reconciliation." "Reconciliation?" I asked. "If you agree not to testify against him or testify in his favor, it could mitigate the sentence. In return, he is willing to apologize publicly and undergo psychological rehabilitation." I laughed, for the first time in many days. "Mr. Wilson, my grandson tried to kill me for the money that I am now leaving to his wife. Do you really think I care about his apology?" "I understand your position," the lawyer said cautiously. "But think about it. He is your flesh and blood after all. Maybe you should give him a chance to make amends." "Mr. Wilson," I said, standing up, "some actions cannot be undone. Some people don't deserve a second chance. Tell the defense that I will testify in full and demand the maximum punishment." Cassandra was waiting for me at home with bags from the grocery store. Over the past few weeks, she had practically moved in with me, leaving her apartment only to sleep. We both needed company to cope with the aftermath of that terrible night. "How did it go with the lawyer?" she asked, unpacking the groceries in the kitchen. "Everything's ready," I replied, helping her. "The will is signed and notarized. Now you're officially my heir." Cassandra paused, holding a carton of milk in her hands. "Rosalind, I still feel awkward about this. I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of the situation." "Nonsense," I interrupted. "You're the only person who cares about me as a living person, not as a source of inheritance. Who else should I leave my property to?" "Don't you have other relatives? Distant, but still blood relatives?" "I have a cousin in California. We haven't spoken in 15 years, and a nephew in New York who sends Christmas cards." I put the milk in the refrigerator. "They'll find out about my death in the newspaper and regret not keeping in touch." Cassandra smiled sadly. "Family isn't just blood, is it?" "That's right. Family is those who are there when you need help. Those who care for you not out of obligation, but out of love." We cooked dinner together, simple spaghetti with vegetables. Cassandra talked about her visit to the doctor, how her baby was growing, her plans to find a job after giving birth. I listened and thought about how quickly life can change. A month ago, I was a lonely old woman with an indifferent grandson. Now I have a daughter I love and a grandson I will love from the first day of his life. "How's the divorce going?" I asked over dinner. The lawyer filed the papers yesterday, Cassandra replied. Brandon may not agree, but given the circumstances, the court will rule in my favor. Will he fight it? I don't know. His lawyer called and suggested family therapy. She snorted. Therapy with the man who tried to poison me. And what did you say? That the only therapy I need is to get out of this marriage as quickly as possible. After dinner, we sat in the living room, and I showed Cassandra the family albums. The photos of Brandon as a child evoked strange feelings in me, pity for the child he was, and disgust for the man he had become. He looks so innocent, Cassandra remarked, looking at a picture of 10-year-old Brandon on a bicycle. Maybe he was, I replied, or maybe I just didn't know how to read the warning signs. What signs? He never regretted his bad deeds. Only that he got caught, I said, flipping through the pages of the album. When he broke the neighbor's window, he cried not out of shame, but out of fear of punishment. When he lied to his teachers, he was upset not because of the lie, but because of his bad grades. Children often behave that way. Yes, but usually it goes away with age. With Brandon, it only got worse. Cassandra was silent for a long time, looking at the photos. You know what scares me the most? She finally said. That the child might inherit his character traits. Character isn't inherited, I objected. It's shaped by upbringing, environment, and parental example. Your child will have a different mother, a different family, different values. But genes? Genes determine eye color and susceptibility to diabetes. The capacity for empathy and conscience is nurtured. We spent the evening sorting through photographs. I put the pictures with Brandon in a separate box, not to throw away, but not to keep in plain sight. Maybe someday his child would want to know what his father looked like as a child, but not now. The next day, Detective Martinez called. He had news about the case. Mrs. Sterling, your grandson has agreed to plead guilty to all charges. This means that the case will not go to trial. There will only be sentencing. And what sentence is expected? Considering the guilty plea and no previous convictions, 7 to 10 years. But there is one condition. What is it? He wants to meet with you before sentencing, to formally apologize. I thought for a second. No, I replied. I have nothing to say to him, and I don't want to hear his apologies. I understand. What about Mrs. Cassandra? Ask her yourself, but I think the answer will be the same. That evening, I told Cassandra about the detective's call. He wants to apologize? She asked. Now that he realizes he won't get the inheritance? Apparently, yes. How convenient, Cassandra said bitterly. He kept quiet while he was hoping for leniency. Now that everything is lost, he's decided to play on our pity. You don't want to see him? Never again, she replied firmly. I want my child to grow up without even knowing his father's name. A week later, Brandon was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Detective Martinez told me about it on the phone. He asked me to tell you that he regrets what he did. He added, Tell him I don't care, I replied and hung up. Cassandra was at the doctor's when I got the news. When she got home, she found me in the kitchen with a cup of tea. Is something wrong? She asked, noticing my pensive mood. Brandon got 8 years, I said calmly. Cassandra sat down across from me, her hands resting on her belly, which was already starting to show. Okay, she said after a pause. By the time he's released, our child will be 8 years old enough to understand why he doesn't have a father. Aren't you afraid he'll try to regain his parental rights? I'll fight it. I have all the documents about the attempted poisoning. I have witnesses. What court would give custody of a child to a man who tried to kill his pregnant wife? We sat in silence, each thinking our own thoughts. For me, it was the end of a long story with a grandson whom I loved, but who turned out to be a stranger. For Cassandra, It was the beginning of a new life without the man who had betrayed her in the most terrible way. "Rosalind," she said suddenly, "thank you." "For what?" "For not turning away from me after everything that happened, for giving me and the child a home, for becoming my real family." "Thank you," I replied, "for showing me what real care is, for giving me the opportunity to be a grandmother not out of duty, but out of love." In the evening, we made a list of baby names. Cassandra insisted that the child should have my surname, Sterling. That way, the family name would live on, but in a new and better form. Brandon Sterling had disappeared from our lives, leaving only painful memories. But soon there would be a new Sterling, a child who would grow up surrounded by love, not greed, who would learn the value of human life, not the cost of inheritance. 6 months later, I was sitting in the nursery that Cassandra and I had set up on the second floor of my house. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating the white crib, the dresser with the changing table, and the rocking chair in which I planned to rock my great-grandson or great-granddaughter. Cassandra was 7 months pregnant, and her belly already resembled a small watermelon. The doctors said everything was going well. There were no signs of any effects from the poisoning. The baby was developing normally, and at the last ultrasound, we found out it was going to be a boy. "Rosalind, are you sure about the name?" Cassandra asked, settling into the chair next to me. "James Sterling sounds beautiful, but it's the name of your late husband." "That's exactly why I want the baby to be named that," I replied, stroking the wooden bars of the crib. "My Gerald was a kind, honest man. Let his name live on in a new generation, in a child who will be raised right." Over the months, our lives settled into a calm rhythm. Cassandra officially divorced Brandon. He didn't resist, perhaps realizing the futility of the struggle. She found a job as a remote marketer at a small company, which allowed her to work from home and prepare for motherhood. We never talked about Brandon. As if by silent agreement, we avoided any mention of him. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that I missed the boy he had been as a child, but I quickly dismissed those memories. That child had died long ago, or perhaps he had never existed. "Don't you feel sorry?" Cassandra asked suddenly, "about depriving him of his inheritance?" "No," I replied honestly. "A man who is willing to kill for money doesn't deserve that money. Even if he's your flesh and blood?" "Blood is just biology," I said, standing up and walking over to the window overlooking the garden. "A real family is created by choice, care, and love. You chose to take care of me when you could have just disappeared after the divorce. I chose to accept you and your child into my family. That's much stronger than any blood ties." Cassandra ran her hand over her belly, where her unborn baby was moving beneath her palm. "Sometimes I'm afraid he'll be like his father." "Outwardly, perhaps," I agreed, "but character depends on upbringing, and we will raise him." Spring in San Antonio was warm and sunny. I spent most of my time in the garden, tidying up the flower beds and preparing the yard for the baby's arrival. I wanted little James to grow up in a beautiful, well-kept place where he could play and learn to appreciate nature. Detective Martinez called occasionally to let me know how Brandon was doing in prison. He seemed to be a quiet inmate, causing no trouble for the administration and working in the library. I listened to these reports with indifference. I was no longer interested in the life of the man who had tried to kill me. "What if he tries to contact us after his release?" Cassandra asked once. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," I replied. "It will be many years before he is released. James will be in school by then, and you may be remarried." "I don't think I'll ever want to get married again." Cassandra interrupted me. "After Brandon, it's hard to trust men. Time will pass, and you'll realize that not all men are capable of betrayal. But there's no need to rush. You have a home, a family, a child. The rest will fall into place. My doctor said that for a 72-year-old woman, I was in excellent shape. The poisoning had left no serious consequences, and I felt energetic and ready to take on the role of grandmother. I had plans to teach James how to cook my signature dishes, tell him about our family history, excluding my father, and take him to museums and parks. Attorney Wilson warned that Brandon might try to contest the will after his release, but I wasn't worried. The documents were drawn up correctly. There were enough witnesses, and the attempted murder provided solid grounds for disinheritance. Rosalind, Cassandra said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, do you think we should tell James the truth about his father? Someday we probably will, I replied after thinking about it, but not now, and not in the next few years. Let him develop as a person first, understand the difference between right and wrong. What if he wants to meet his father? That will be his choice when he becomes an adult. We can't decide for him, but we can give him the right values so he can make an informed decision. In June, we received news that Brandon and Cassandra's house had been sold to pay off debts. I offered to buy their personal belongings, but she refused. I don't need anything from my past life, she said. I want to start over. We completely redecorated her room, bought new furniture and new clothes. Cassandra was like a new person. She became more confident, calmer, and smiled more. Pregnancy suited her. She blossomed, looked younger, as if she had shed the burden of an unhappy marriage. Sometimes in the evenings, we would sit in the living room, and I would knit booties for my future great-grandson, while Cassandra read books on raising children. These peaceful evenings were the complete opposite of the tension I had felt before when I was waiting for Brandon's visits. You know, Cassandra said, putting down another book, I don't think what happened at Christmas was an accident. What do you mean? If Brandon hadn't tried to poison you, I would never have known who he really was. I would have lived with him my whole life and had children who would have grown up with a potential murderer. Maybe you're right, I agreed. Sometimes the most terrible events turn out to be blessings in disguise. And I would never have known what a real family is, she added. Brandon never cared for me the way you do, even at the very beginning of our relationship. July brought heat and the approaching birth. The doctor warned that the baby could arrive at any moment, and we prepared everything we needed. A bag for the hospital, baby clothes, phone numbers. I spent my days putting the finishing touches on the nursery, preparing frozen meals for after the birth, and buying the last few items for the newborn. The excitement grew with each passing day, but it was the pleasant excitement of anticipation, not anxiety. One hot July evening, Cassandra suddenly grabbed her stomach. I think it's starting, she said, her voice a mixture of fear and joy. Then let's go meet your son, I replied, grabbing the car keys. 12 hours later, James Sterling was born, a healthy boy weighing 3 kilograms, 200 grams. He had his mother's dark hair and gray eyes, which, according to the doctor, could change during his first year of life. I held my great-grandson in my arms and thought about how far we had come in those months, from attempted murder to the birth of a new life, from a broken family to a new one, built on love rather than greed. Little James slept in my arms, unaware of the drama that led to his arrival in our home. He will never know his father, but he will be surrounded by the care and love of 2 women who will do everything to raise him to be a good person. Somewhere in a prison cell sat a man who could have been this child's grandfather, but chose the path of betrayal and murder. His choice led to him losing everything: his family, his inheritance, his freedom, the right to be called part of our family. I looked at the sleeping baby and knew that this child would never know the greed that ruined his father. He would grow up knowing the value of human life and dignity. and this will be my last gift to my family, raising a new generation that will correct the mistakes of the past.